Speaking of Thanksgiving, uh, I was just wondering what year it was going to happen because the human population is so out of control that how it used to be safe to travel on Thanksgiving Day, like that was the day to do it. I was like, what year is that going to change? And it was this year. We got stuck in traffic on Thanksgiving Day, big time.
Oh, well, I think that's largely a factor of, where you're traveling too. There's places that are always going to be congested around LA and stuff. I used to drive down for Thanksgiving the day before, and it was this
Well, this is
took
urban
9 hours.
sprawl. Urban sprawl now looks like LA.
So good morning, Skylar. This Tuesday, December 3rd at 8:58 a.m.
Yeah, we're a little bit early, letting people tune in. We were just discussing how it's important to cut down on dropping the F-bomb. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard considering the topic, and we've got a topic trying to come in and take the place of our scheduled topic, regenerative ranching. We'll see if the people that wanted to give their take on regenerative ranching call in, because my plan is to let them explain regenerative ranching to me instead of me try to tell them what's wrong with it, because I've done like 10 videos on every aspect of it. So it's more interesting to me to hear them expose themselves and how little they actually understand about it. And of course, the other topic, Jack, why I want to call this the Point Raised podcast. We're never going to run out of Point Raised stuff to talk about. So the latest may be good news. I still can't decide that it's actually good news. Go ahead. You tell everybody what happened.
Well, it's okay. You and I have fun with the good cop, bad cop, and who's wearing it at what moment in which show. So we were going to do a show. We are going to do a show on regenerative ranching, which it's indirectly related to what goes on at Point Raised, because that term, of course, has no USDA certified meaning, so anybody can claim it. Like natural has no meaning. But the news yesterday at about 1:15, I got an email from Melanie Gunn, the representative from the National Park Service, saying the much anticipated, much awaited final decision in the NEPA process. The Park Service is going to take the fence down. It's official now. We kind of expected that would come. We're all waiting with bated breath when that would happen. And unfortunately, in the press release itself, there was no date of when it would happen, just that the final decision was made. There was, as expected, a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact, that came with this decision, meaning that taking down the 2 mile to, I call it 3 mile, but 2 to 3 mile long, 8-foot tall fence barrier in the southern border of the park would not, surprise, have a negative environmental impact to let wild elk be wild in a national park. And of course, no mention, as Skylar will jump into, I'm sure, my friend, of the effect of thousands of private cows that do have a negative impact on the park at all times. But that wasn't the source of the study. The elk will be released. We just don't know when. But then the last bit of news, which I just got like an hour and a half ago, was in this morning's Chronicle, reporter Tara Duggan, God bless her, I'm not sure if it's Duggan or Dugan, Duggan, quoted Melanie Gunn, the same person, and said, in fact, let me dig that up. It said, quote, the park, so this is a quote from today's San Francisco Chronicle, God bless the local papers, with Tara Duggan. The park may remove sections of the fence not immediately adjacent to agricultural lands as soon as this week, though the removal of the entire fence could take some time, said Melanie Gunn, spokesperson, in an email. So I don't think it was the email that I received, at least not that I could read. Maybe it was an additional email with, of course, journalists calling in trying to get more news of this.
All right.
So anyway, last thing I'll say is, sorry, it's good news. It's good news that they have announced, you smile, wise guy. It's good news that they came out with a final decision before the Trump administration comes in and appoints a rancher as God of Point Raised or something. But of course, like you, my friend, we're going to have a cynical contest today. I won't celebrate until the fence comes down before the Trump administration takes over and does God knows what.
Okay, well, I got you beat, because they could take the whole fence down, and as long as the problem is in the park, so what? I mean, understand that the people who badly want the elk removed, the people that want the elk killed, the people whom the Park Service has killed elk 4 are still in the park. The people that want the elk dead are still in the park. Okay. So if you have, and the people who did the killing themselves are still in charge of Point Reyes in terms of being the staff. The people who said everything's fine, as nearly 50% of populations of species died in single seasons and called that fine, those people are still out there running things. So the very first time that they talked about taking this fence down, I said, out of the frying pan and into the fire, you know.
Meaning out of the frying pan of the reserve, out into the fire of being around on the ranch lands where ranchers don't want them and are tempted to abuse them, shall we say, or chase them off, or worse. Is that your point?
Yes. I mean, they do. I mean, the Park Service staff and the ranchers are both guilty of hazing elk, and it's been documented. And some of it wasn't supposed to be seen, and some of it was done as part of testing for Johne's disease, which of course the cattle are spreading. And they killed, what they killed, 35 elk testing for Johne's disease, healthy ones, pregnant females.
And they don't kill the cash crop cow to test for Johne's disease, even though they are the very likely source of the disease, because it's a common cattle disease and very uncommon in wild animals.
No, but that brings up an important difference between the cattle that are out there and the elk. The elk exist for a purpose. They have a role in the ecology of the land. The cattle are there to get big and be slaughtered. So they are killed before they actually even reach an age that you can visually see the signs of Johne's disease, because that's the beauty of ranching. Hey, extract from the land, get fat so we can make money off of your dead carcass. That's not nature, people. That's not nature.
So maybe we can do what one brilliant orator calls the weave and talk about both Point Reyes issues here and also regenerative ranching. Regenerative ranching is kind of a vague phrase with lots of different definitions. I've also heard similar systems called rotational grazing or holistic management. And Alan Savory, I think I'm not alone in considering him kind of the father of regenerative ranching. He did a TED Talk, over, I think, 13 years ago, which was very successful. Alan Savory is a South African cattle rancher who was saying that the general idea is imitate the behavior of, I think the fancy word for is historic megafauna. Is that the term they use? To move cows around the land as opposed to having them stand in giant feedlots like down in Harris Ranch in Southern California. And that would mimic the benefits that wild animals or ungulates, including tule elk, have on the land. That's the general should I tip my hand and call it BS right off, or should I wait and save that for later? Oh, by the way, I've in my title down there, Jack Gescheit, treespiritproject.com/regenerative BS. I guess that tips my hand as to my opinion about this stuff, which we're going to get into.
I've done an entire episode on Alan Savory, and of course his big awakening of the importance of megafauna actually moving came after he slaughtered generations of elephants in South Africa, thinking, oh, I need to step in and fix what isn't broken, because surely these big animals are causing damage to the land. He's just another person, another human, thinking that he knew better, caused just like what he did. He should be crucified. He should be hanging on a cross right now, slowly being killed. And instead he's giving TED Talks and making money.
Now, I'm sorry, Skylar, is this your good cop or your bad cop right there?
I get worse. I'll just tell you that.
So that might be as good as we're going to get, folks. Oh, by the way, Fab Dance or Fab Dank, I'm not sure, I'm excited for the program, and he suggests BS right off. Just call it what it is. And Sledge, our buddy Sledge is here, so we can get him in the show as well. And thank you for coming back, sir.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I just put your chats up on the screen with us. Let me quote Melanie Gunn really quick, since you talked about Melanie Gunn. This is from an interview I had with her a few years ago. God, that was painful. She said then that it was important for me to understand that even if the elk were allowed outside the fences and the ranches went away, the elk would be killed because they aren't allowed outside the park. She emphasized her point by stating how many elk the Department of Fish and Wildlife kill every year, which according to her is in the 400 range. And it's funny because in some of my other videos recently, people not understanding, rightfully so, not understanding this weird crap happening in Point Reyes, because it's very confusing. We're like, oh, why don't you contact California Fish and Wildlife? You know, they'll help. Like, people don't understand.
They don't have jurisdiction. It's federal. They don't have jurisdiction. Yeah.
What?
It's same with the effect of cows in the park polluting the local water, Marin County, polluting state water, California State, and polluting, violating the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act as well. But in all ways, and none of those are enforced for all sorts of reasons we can get into here. But regenerative ranching is the idea that if you move cattle around over larger areas of land, that not only reduces their impact, which we see, you've documented, Skylar, many times. It looks like a friggin' nuclear bomb wasteland out there, just beat down, trampled down, overgrazed down to dirt. And these are relatively small herds on relatively large parcels of land. It's about as good as it gets out there. And it still looks like hell, 8-9 months of the year when it's not raining. So that's the theory. And, we could either, both of us you've done films, I could do a PowerPoint on like the 10 reasons it's complete nonsense and it doesn't work. Maybe we'll just do, again, I love the term, the weave. It just cracks me up. the brilliant weave of wandering all over the place and coming back to target or not. So moving the cows around is actually what we see to some extent on Point Reyes. There's large areas of land and it's still beaten down. There's just no way in the West, in the dry West, where cows don't behave very differently than quote unquote, historic megafauna like bison.
Well, before you give away too much, let's let Sledge, who's been waiting since last week, to give his piece on regenerative ranching.
Yes.
So, Sledge, I hope you have your microphone ready. I'm going to put the link up. Oh, he had trouble last week, didn't he?
Well, however it works.
All right, the call-in link is up. This is I'm going to call it an intro to regenerative ranching program because there's so many aspects of it to cover. There's no way we're going to cover it all. And we're also somehow trying to talk about the elk situation in Point Reyes on top of that. So the call-in link is up. So please call in because I'm biting my tongue.
And just for a few people that might hear this that don't know the Point Reyes issues, which I hope is a few, the elk, there are 3 herds of elk at Point Reyes. The largest of 3 herds is inside the fenced northernmost peninsula Point Reyes called the Tule Elk Reserve at Tomales Point on the Point Reyes Peninsula, all those names. And they're only fenced for cattle ranching. The wild animals inside a national park unit are fenced in so that thousands of cattle can roam over, roughly 18 to 28,000 acres of parkland. Depends on how you measure it, whether it's in the park or on the adjacent boundaries of.
Isn't it interesting, Jack, that you said that the Park Service said they decided that there would be no significant impact? I guess no significant negative impact.
Correct.
Okay. I guess they're talking about an actual natural ecological environment because the ranchers themselves swear that some elk visiting their property is the difference between them going bankrupt or not.
Well, that's the cattle ranchers making the claim that they don't want any elk on their land eating any of their grass owned by the public or drinking from their water sources. But that's not, despite how you can bang on them, the National Park Service did their own independent study and came up with a finding of no significant impact, that releasing the elk would damage, I guess, Tomales Point. They weren't, it's my understanding is that Fonzie, finding no significant impact, they didn't do a study of how the elk would affect the ranch lands, which is the so-called pastoral zone, which we call the beat to hell by cattle zone. Mike the Vegan does a debunking of, yes, Dan
There's our
Dan Spear,
friend.
Don Spear, John Spear. Oh, John Spear, John Spear. Hey, John.
Howdy, John.
Howdy, John. Yes, Mike the Vegan does a great thing of debunking the regenerative ranching with a lot of facts and information. And, you know, each show has its own flavor. And I kind of agonize John about, you know, you can do a very PowerPointy, appropriately, you know, facts and figures. For me, I would just point to studies by, you know, the EPA and NASA and United Nations, you know, FAO, pointing to the destruction that cattle do with methane emissions, which is pretty much ignored by regenerative ranching. And I do want to throw this in. I was Mike the Vegan, a vegan activist for people who follow vegan podcasts and such. Damn vegans. And also another show for the future. And also Ed Winters, known as Earthling Ed in the vegan community, did another wonderful show ripping into a podcast of two guys, just like me and Skylar here. But it was the richest man on the planet. Guess who that is? Elon Musk. Yeah. Talking with the number one podcaster on the planet, or at least in America that I know of, Joe Rogan. And they were both talking about meat has no effect on the climate. And they just threw it out there with, I mean, it was kind of chilling know-nothingness, just saying that without citing anything. And I wince in part, A, because it's so absurd and disturbing that these two powerful people who influence hundreds of millions of people can just throw out 100% nonsense. It's not even like debatable. And yet, aren't I doing the same thing right now by saying, oh, they're wrong, also without pointing to any statistics?
Right.
So to cover myself, I just want to say United Nations, you know, has done studies on the effect of cattle on the climate. Duh.
I don't think statistics work particularly well. I think people have to go and look and experience for themselves. Just like when I did the shark thing and I would try and put out statistics of how little sharks bit humans. It does not matter because emotion takes over everything else. We have Sledge in the waiting room and I'm going to let him in. And by the way, John Spear, Fan Dunk. Who is that? Do you know who that is?
Fab Dance, FABDANC, maybe.
Any of you people that want to call in, please do. If you prefer to chat, you can. The link goes up. You click on the link, and it will ask for your microphone permission. And Sledge is in here twice. I'm going to choose the second one where I can see him.
Okay, and I'll just read Fab Dance.
Yeah, keep getting dropped.
You're on.
You're on. We got you.
Hey,
welcome.
I keep getting dropped out here. I'm in the southern part of Indiana.
Well,
I don't know what's going on, but
we'll try.
No, I believe in. I mean, it's a great conversation we're having here, and my big thing is I like to listen to the whole program because somebody gave me 2 ears and one mouth, and then I like to speak up when we've brought the whole subject. But yeah, I grew up in California, the Bay Area, went out there to Point Reyes. I saw deer wildlife in Pleasanton go from wheat fields and deer and pheasants to absolutely nothing. I'm watching the migratory birds from the top of Mount Diablo go through the Central Valley. My father in 1973 said, you better look now because in 20 years, there's going to be no migratory birds going down that Central Valley. And
why is that
was true?
Why?
Farming and population growth.
And when you say farming, do you mean ranching?
Both the agricultural and cattle. The Delta system out there in the Central Valley, I mean, it goes way back before we were even born, Lake Tulare and all that, when it used to just be a big marsh out there. And, putting in all the canals and all the farming and all that took away all the flood fields. And,
I mean, certainly there's a big impact of agriculture. I just, being someone who wants to educate people about the massive damage that specifically cattle do, I'm always distinguishing. I don't use the word agricultural very much unless I say animal ag or, plant agriculture. I do separate them out because the effect of cattle is so much greater, greater.
Oh, yes. And
sorry.
When you see these really big farms instead of what they had a long time ago, where you'd have, your mom and pop down the road with 20 or 30, 40, 50 acres, whatever it was, and 10, 15 cows and a local butcher, as compared to what we have now, which is just mass industrial feedlots that just destroy everything, absolutely everything.
So
And
do you make the distinction, sir, and to both of you, of course, we can do a three-way here. So there have been a lot of pushing against so-called factory farming. For me, I say factory farming became necessary because of the population of people eating meat in this country, 340 million Americans eating lots of meat and milk. We need to mass produce cows. You can't say, okay, use more land even. There's already 30, I think it's 30, the stat is 30% of ice-free land on Earth is devoted to grazing cattle. Now, of course, cattle may move around areas, but that's a huge amount of land taken up by cattle. And to do regenerative or to be lighter on the land, to not have them stand in giant feedlots, concentrating feeding operations, CAFOs, you'd need even more land, which we don't have to devote to cattle. And that doesn't even deal with the topic of methane from cattle, which comes out of them, mostly from the front of them, regardless of whether they're in feedlots or not. In fact, regenerative ranching means they eat more grass, more roughage typically, and the roughage means they produce more methane. So when folks who are pro-regenerative ranching they always talk carbon sequestration and soil sequestration and the roots of grass stimulated by bovines, blah, 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 blah. They don't mention methane. Did I just shut you both up? I hope not.
Oh,
No.
I'm patiently waiting for Sedge. If I could pose a question to you, the fact that you're in Indiana, but you also are familiar with California, you have a good understanding of how different the climate is here in the arid state. So you visually have seen how back where you live, the land probably doesn't react quite as dramatically as the land here did to the introduction of cattle. Would you say that you've seen that?
Oh, absolutely.
And I had to learn that because I moved to California 30 some years ago, and a lot of people are like, well, hey, the cattle on the East Coast, everything looks fine. I'm like, well, it's not the same.
No, it's not the same. It's very dry. It's very dry and arid out there. When it rains out in California, well, most of the time it rains up in the mountains, and then everything flows down. Especially when you get like from San Francisco going south, you're pretty much in a desert. People don't realize
it flows down. If it flows down, if the waterways aren't all diverted for agriculture.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to include another commenter from Fab Dank. He says, I think a big challenge is that those who tend to favor regenerative also tend to reject science at large. And that Alan Savory is that to a T. So right on with that comment. He also says he can't call in. I'm in an office doing my corporate job. LOL.
Well,
and finally, last comment he says is the economics do not work out for regen. Not enough land to produce enough cows, and you would need to block all beef imports.
Sedge, aren't you representing regenerative ranching? Aren't you the opposite side of this?
Well, I'm kind of right in the middle of it. I mean, where I'm at now, and one of the big reasons I left California was just the sheer politics of it. You couldn't find, you were deep end on one side or deep end on the other, and there was no coming to the middle. There was just none of it. I mean, where I lived, my neighbors were just so one-sided, and then across the street, they were somewhat so one-sided. You could never get anybody together to get any kind of a conversation, to get anything done. And as long as you had a monopoly on one side, well, nothing was ever going to change. I mean, nothing. And it didn't matter, what you felt about one thing, you were going to be wrong. And the other side was like, well, you were going to be wrong. And nobody could come to any kind of an understanding to get. And I was just like, I'm done with these people out here.
That's unique to California, huh?
It was very unique out there. Is it somewhat out here? It's not as bad out here. I will say that it's not as bad. We have small farms around here. Most of them, there's one big dairy farm that nobody really likes, but for the most part, we have a bunch of small farms out here. And for the most part, I mean, once they said, okay, no, this butcher place is getting shut down, you're going to have to send everybody to these big slaughter places. it basically took a lot of people and just, well, they're not going to send their cows 150 miles to go get them slaughtered for the local people.
So I want to throw in some numbers here while you're talking numbers. There are approximately 10 million cows in California, approximately 100 million cows in America, and approximately 1.5 billion cows worldwide that we use to eat and take products from. And of course, we're not even talking the abusive ethics of slaughtering cows in a humane way and all that nonsense. Separate issue. But in each cow puts out approximately 220 pounds of methane per year. 220 pounds of methane per year times 1.5 billion cows globally. Cows are the greatest source of methane emissions on planet Earth. And of course, unlike fracking, which produces a lot of methane and methane leakage and delivery systems and such, we don't need to eat cows. People want to eat cows. They love eating cows. We were all raised to eat cows and drink milk and such, but it's not an essential product for us to consume to generate all that methane. And that's, again, assuming you believe in science and you trust, NASA scientists to do correct satellite imagery of methane emissions and the effect of methane on our atmosphere. It's wildly more heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide.
What's astonishing about that 1.5 billion that you quoted? You can't really think about that compared to the 8 billion humans, because those cattle are being killed almost as fast as they're being created. So there's 1.5 billion at all time, despite the trillions of animals that are killed every year, trillions that are slaughtered every year for animal agriculture. I mean, that's shocking that you can still have 1.5 billion despite never-ending slaughter.
Yeah, well, that's like here. I mean, do I eat beef all the time? Absolutely not. Maybe once a week I eat beef. I've raised chickens out here. I raised rabbits out here. I mean, I've got cages outside where I had at one point like 700 rabbits, that never touched the ground in their cages. Grew my alfalfa right here on the property. And, it was great, but the FDA came in and said, nope, can't do it. Shut it down.
Reminds me of the Tom Lehrer joke that he was into animal husbandry until they caught him at it.
Life in cages, never touching the ground. Doesn't get much better.
So Fab Dance, so I'm not even pronouncing your moniker right. Fab Dance, I'm going to call it. Anyway, you can't compare east to the 100th meridian in this country to west of the 100th meridian, talking about the water. And then he says, I grew up in Montana, so big on cattle ranching and anti-wildlife, particularly anti-predator. And that's, of course, that's Wildlife Services, Skylar, which you mention every show as you should, that there's a division of the USDA which is just assigned to kill wild predators, wild animals, bears, bobcats, puma, anything that dare wants to eat a cow out there on the land where wild animals live and where our domesticated, overbred cattle are thrown out to be, fed to the proverbial wolves, which will then also shoot wolves, even in places like Montana.
If we go back to my Melanie Gunn quote and the fact that the elk won't be allowed to expand outside of Point Reyes National Seashore, I ask everybody, why do you think that is? What's the number one reason? Because human beings hate elk? Because elk threaten people's lives? What's the real reason that wildlife have been cut down everywhere? What's the number one reason? Why does the government have an agency called Wildlife Services that kills millions of wildlife every year? Who are they doing that for?
Oh,
cattle industry.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to. It doesn't even always have to be animal agriculture. Like they can kill them to protect crops too.
I don't know the breakdown of statistics there. I agree. And, it's tricky. It's little apples and oranges because I heard there was a reporter that came out. I will not speak his name because I was so frustrated with him. He's a sweet guy who was a reporter for Sierra Magazine, the magazine for the Sierra Club, with 1 million members. And he did an article on Point Reyes and the cows versus elk issue like 2 years ago. And yet, so I stood him out there. I pointed to the lands which were devastated by cattle. And I pointed to areas where the elk were, which was, lush and green with the native coastal scrub and coyote brush and such. And he seemed to get it. I mean, he wasn't contradicting me, as reporters will kind of listen politely. But then when he wrote the story, the conclusion of the story was, well, if we let the elk out and got the cows out, then the elk would overpopulate the park, and within a few years they would overrun the place and they don't have any natural predators. And I was like, where did that conclusion come from? It was so bizarre that he was ignoring the damage that cattle were doing for the last, 50 years in the park. But then he was projecting that in 10 years, because there's no wolves in the park, I guess, as predators of elk, that the elk would become a problem. And by the way, just as people say, well, what is the answer, Jack? The answer is we desperately need wild elk, not domesticated cattle, in other parts of California. So you could take sub-herds out of Point Reyes if we got that lucky once we get the cows out, and they increase their numbers up from the current about 700 elk in the park to 800, 900, 1,500, 2,000. And then you could consider in the future, 10 years down the line, if we get that far, taking a sub-herd and moving it to another area of California where elk would be welcome and do the wonderful ecological benefit that wild animals do. Completely different behavior from cows.
Now,
Yeah,
I've been wanting.
like it was friends of my father's. They had a lot of land. I think it was just a little bit west of Gilroy, if I remember. And way back in the day, they used to have elk down there. And I left there a long time ago, but
they still do. There's still herds in the Central Valley area.
Yeah, and I think it was in the early 80s, late 70s is when I think it was Dianne Feinstein who wanted to kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a big up. I mean, I'm big into nature. It's one of the big reasons I moved out here was I wanted to get back into a little bit of land in the forest, and just get away from that. But yeah, the elk need to run free. We don't, especially at Point Reyes in the national park. I mean, state park. We've got cattle just destroying everything. I've watched all of his videos and stuff like that. And, before I popped in, I was just like, I'm just, take my time and listen to what everybody has to say for weeks before you jump in. Otherwise, what are you doing?
Nice.
Just making nonsense.
As an activist in the park. Oh, by the way, I love your background, Sledge. You look like a professional podcaster there. Really. It's like, who calls in with a black background, like black velvet there? Really nice. Good job.
Well,
everybody who calls in, get their black velvet background.
No, it's all really nice wood back there. But
as one of many activists at Point Reyes, I had numerous conversations over the years with people who I think the cattle should be here. And then I would say, did you know that the ranchers were paid millions of dollars to leave and then reneged on the deal, kept the money and didn't leave? And then they lobbied the government to stay. I'm like, oh no, I didn't know that. So basic information. This is why Skylar and I, repeat this stuff till we're blue in the face. They don't know the information. And I like what you said, which is you listen, you've got one mouth and two ears. I think I have three mouths and two ears, but listening is good. And then repeating what people say to Skylar's point about, I was talking about this with politics recently, with the recent election as a demonstration of it. Facts and figures are important. I think they're actually critical, and we need science and we need institutions that we trust instead of autocrats. For our one centralized information source is a problem. However, once you have established science, whatever that means for somebody, then absolutely stories and emotion are what rule the day and win elections.
Studying ecology these last few years, one thing that I can't explain very well, but I find fascinating, is the impact on the land that comes as a result of animals being there that were part of the evolutionary process of that land. You can't, in my opinion, I'm using the word can't, which is probably a turnoff, but in my opinion, you can't put a substitute animal there that eats grass and has hooves and say that it's the same thing. It has no relationship with that land. And you can tell by the way that the land responds to those animals. And here's the question that I ask to people who say, oh, well, what's the matter with cattle being there if there were bison? Early California, the historic records, the people that came out and jotted down what it looked like would talk about just oceans of herd animals and the skies blackened by birds and just shocking amounts of animals. But the land was healthy and it was able to support all of these animals, and the soil came back nice and rich every year. And my question is, how? How is it possible that there was even more life, mammal life in particular, and yet the land was healthy?
So,
But now we have even though the number of cattle is crazy, overall, the fraction of non-human mammalian life out here is small, and yet the land looks like it can't handle it. To me, there's obviously a difference, and this is directed to Sedge, because I think you were going to advocate for regenerative ranching, right?
Yeah, I certainly believe that it's got to be done in a way. I mean, if we're going to put these things on giant feedlots, I mean, like you said, now we've got this giant problem with the waste. Where are we going to where are you going to scatter all this waste? Because where's it going to drain? It's going to drain into the earth. It's going to get into the water system. So, yeah,
That goes right.
there has to be a come together where we can say, look, because I remember driving down the I-5, and all of a sudden you could just smell it, and then you'd see those giant feedlots, and you were just like, my God, I couldn't wait to get down to my dad's friend's place, where tens of thousands of acres. Oh, they've got like 100 cows, and they have the elk, and they have the deer. You just go walk out there, and there's the elk. Would they run away? Yeah, and we pretend to be sneaky kids and stuff like that, and get up to them. And there were some of the friendly elk that would hang around the house. But yeah, when you're talking about everybody wanting I don't even know what they're called now as far as steaks go, like ribeyes or whatever they are, the New York strip. I probably really couldn't tell you. But there has to be a come together somewhere in the middle.
So to your point, Sledge, by the way, the idea of it's a wonderful notion. You have a farm with 50 cows or 100 cows. And, one could make a cogent argument that I wouldn't push back hard on, that is more ecologically sustainable. However, it's not scalable. You can't feed 340 million Americans on 100 cow farms without taking up a huge amount more land, which we don't have. And then you still have a water shortage in the West, and you still have too much methane in the air. Go ahead.
Point Reyes National Seashore smells like shit. You don't have to go down the I-5. And this is supposed to be an example of how to do it right. This is supposed to be an example of living with nature, and it smells like a feedlot. And I think that this is pretty fascinating too. I've started several episodes about why doesn't nature smell like shit? I mean, and I've gone to the point where I'm going around picking up wildlife poop and putting it to my nose. I'm like, I still barely smell this. It just shows, it's one of those many things to think about, that it's obviously not the same. And also, if you ever go to a farmed animal sanctuary and they've got like maybe 3 cows, their land is effed. Their land is effed. It can't even handle 3 cows. It's not scalable. But you have Audubon coming out with BS about how these grass-fed ranches are providing habitat for birds and things like that. Well, then, Sedge, how is it possible that even in the good places, you yourself witnessed the decline of wildlife if it's such wonderful habitat? It's a replacement habitat. It's all invasive plants. Everything that was here before is gone.
And it is. I mean, what are we going to do? Try to say, okay, well, I was big into earth science and natural science, and in school is one of my biggest things in geology. And I remember I was ridiculed at school, especially in the Pleasanton Valley. My dad was an engineer. You're old enough to know that. Remember the old typewriter with the arms, and then all of a sudden the ball, IBM came out with the ball. Yeah, yep. My father engineered that.
Wow.
The IBM Selectric.
Yeah.
Wow.
And yeah, he worked on the first MRI machine. He did all the mathematical computations for that. But what I proposed way back in the day was when we got out there to Pleasanton in the lab and all that stuff, when he was working all kinds of stuff. I was like, we can't have this mega sprawl like we did in Europe. I grew up in England as a little kid. And so I see socialism and sprawl. And when we came out there, I did this big project. I was like 12, 13 years old, and I stuck with it all the way through high school. Was instead of taking the Pleasanton, Livermore, Dublin Valley that used to have ranches and things like that, and deer would come through our yard, was, hey, we just need to build certain towers. Yeah, is it not going to be the greatest where everybody's not going to have their own home? But if you staggered them and built them in different heights going from west to east, you'd get like 80% of the people would be able to get a sunset if you lived on one side, and 80% of the people would get the sunrise coming on the other. You'd have Mount Diablo and all kinds of other things like that. But it also has to do with the mega sprawl. Southern California is a little bit different. Once you get down, the LA area like that, you're not going to have as many cows or anything like that because the ground's just not intuitive to it, being very steep, rugged, too dry. But sprawl has a lot to do with having to put these cattle, especially out there in California, into one big bind of a place.
I just got to jump in. I mean, there's sprawl, which is human dwellings, which is one issue. And I think, 50% of land should be set aside and not touched or be rewilded, not managed, but just let to go wild. But that's a completely different issue from cattle. Cattle are an unnecessary, massively destructive, Ken Brower taught me the phrase extractive industry. And so I want to go back to Skylar's point because it's important. And I can do a little bit of a laundry list here about the difference between a herd of cows and a herd of bison. And some of this comes from biologist Julie Phillips, who's been an elktivist and has taught me a bunch. And I know Skylar's interviewed Julie, and she's awesome. But so some of the differences here, the laundry list. 1, cows are much larger. They're bred to be larger, to be fattened either for their milk or for their meat. Bison are smaller animals, for one.
I bet you that's a shocking statement for a lot of people listening, not understanding that cattle actually outweigh bison. Because most people
dairy cows can be like 1,200, 1,400 pounds. And of course, there's variance here, but bison, I think, are 800 pounds, 600 to 900, depending on male, female, and size. Okay, yeah. Their feet are different. Mm-hmm. They have different hooves. Cows have a flat hoof that compacts the ground, and bison have a toe, and they actually puncture and aerate the ground.
Yep.
And of course, they are evolutionarily designed by not mankind, who can't manage anything, ship, compared to how, nature left to its own will devise these perfect systems. And then we interfere and impose our will on them, usually to make money. So different shaped foot, they do a different effect on the land. They move differently. European bovines, cows, are brought in and they tend to stand in one place, and you can move them, as they do with gated
rotational grazing.
Rotational grazing. Thank you, Skylar. But bison are more on the move, as we see in movies depicting herds of bison that used to exist in the Dakotas and stuff. They just move differently. They're lighter on the land. They aerate the ground differently. They eat less. They drink less water. They're adapted for the West. European cows are not. They'll do better in Vermont, I suppose, but we're talking about the West here, where there are, as I said, 10 million cows alone just in California. And then we import food to feed them. And then when cows die, we remove them from the land to kill them, to process them for profit. So you're not leaving a carcass like a bison would die naturally on the land. Mm-hmm. And then wolves would tear into it. Cougars, bears would tear into it. Vultures would clean up the rest. Maggots would get it. I mean, it would just disintegrate. It would not disintegrate. It would go back into the land. That's not what we do with cows. So we bring in all these imports onto the land, and then we extract the product, and we're just using it like, I think, were we talking about this guy where it's just like a warehouse? The land is not actually a natural system anymore. It's completely controlled by mankind in a horrific, destructive, polluting way.
Yeah, well, that was one of the big reasons that I kind of got into the rabbits. I mean, per pound of feed that I had to put into a rabbit was 1/20th to get the same weight out of a cow.
So as a Bugs Bunny fan, I got to ask you, who was killing the rabbits? I'm serious. Tell me.
Yeah, well, I was doing the slaughter of the rabbits, and we had an FDA approved butcher out here and had the whole thing going on. I mean,
Did you do it, or did the butcher kill, or did you kill?
Oh, I helped him kill, but he was an FDA inspector, and he came out, and we had all the facilities, everything here to do it. Everything that we didn't use dehydrated and went into dog food and stuff like that.
How were you killing? I'm sorry. This is such a cul-de-sac, but it's unusual, and maybe you and I'll talk separately. But tell me specifically how you killed a rabbit, a wabbit.
No, we don't want it on this episode. We'll do it in a future one.
Okay, we'll come back for the. Well, I would come back for the vegan show we're going to do, if you will, Sledge.
Yeah, we just put him to sleep.
Oh, save it for the vegan show, buddy. Just put them to sleep. You sang a lullaby, and the little rabbit put his head on the pillow and went to sleep.
Are you sure that they didn't all just die in their sleep, having a nice dream?
No, they were actually just put to sleep.
This, I mean, I'm sorry. The vegan activist to me, just like, you know, the humane kill. Myth. I mean, the other thing about cattle industry. Sorry, Skylar. I got 3 mouths, and then I'll shut up for at least 10 seconds. I promise. But this whole notion of a humane kill. To kill humanely is the greatest oxymoron. The meat industry, and which means, you know, cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, goats. No one, 90% of the population that eats that stuff will not watch the sausage being made.
Oh no!
All right, so we're still on the topic.
Okay, I'm done.
You're not going to win anybody in one episode.
I'm not trying to win. I'm just trying to open up people's minds. Look, I was a meat eater.
Regenerative grazing.
Yes.
Fab Donk asks a good question. Something I'm not 100% sure on. Aren't pastures plowed and seeded to grow particular grasses and plants that could harm cows removed? And it's a great point. Yes, I have footage of point rays getting plowed and reseeded and covered with layer after layer after layer of cow poop. Like Sedge mentioned, there's this waste that needs to be dealt with. And how it's dealt with is a lot of it goes into the ocean, a lot of it goes into rivers and ponds, and a lot of it is respread out onto the land. Again, absolutely nothing like how wildlife would do it or how a natural ecosystem would take place. But because a lot of us are indoctrinated with thinking, oh, that's nature and that's working with the land and that's agriculture. The smell of poop is the smell of money. That's the smell of money, right? I remember the first time I heard this as a child. Where I grew up smelled like animal shit every day. And I mentioned it once as a child, and the men said, oh, that's the smell of money. Ha, ha, ha. Let's all bond in our stupidity. And Point Reyes National Seashore wants to talk about habitat for wildlife, and that Judy lying lawyer wrote in talking about this. Annual crops that do not even belong there and then get mowed down anyway are not habitat, and they can't sequester carbon because even if they didn't die after their 1-year cycle, they get chopped up by the humans. And the wildlife that made the mistake of trying to live in there get chopped up as well, or at the very minimum, chased off. And I have footage of them being chopped up. They don't all escape the way people want to pretend that they do. But, you know.
A completely artificial environment, nothing to do with natural.
Now, unfortunately, all these bad plants come along with animal agriculture. They just don't seem to be able to separate themselves from it. Milk thistle, bull thistle, Italian thistle, yellow star thistle, and correct. Fab Donk. Sorry, what? How am I supposed to say that?
I was saying fab dance. At least it isn't insulting. I don't know what it actually is. Spell it phonetically. Fab dance. Put it in the text phonetically.
Yes. Poison hemlock is a really bad one. All of these things are not particularly good for cattle, and they're definitely bad for the wildlife. And a lot of them just get left behind, which ends up leading to another imbalance because you don't really have anything fighting against those plants because nothing wants them.
Right. Yeah. So the ultimate invasive species, as you said before, it bears repeating, are cattle. And brought in from Europe, behave nothing like the native fauna, and then they're, you know, wildly bred to be something completely unnatural, and then they're removed from the land, and just completely unnatural system. So regenerative ranching, it doesn't take any of that into account. It just says we'll move the cattle around, and that'll stimulate soil growth, and that'll sequester carbon, which, you know, it does to some extent, 20 to 30% perhaps improvement in carbon emissions, but doesn't touch methanes, and still has a huge amount, as Sledge was saying, of manure dropped on the land. So all that stuff is just simply ignored with the most ridiculous. I mean, the trouble is, I know so many people that, oh no, I only eat regenerative ranching, or the regenerative ranching is the answer. I had a guy on a show from, I don't want to, I mean, he was a nice guy, Terra Firma Farms, and he was a well-meaning representative, but he was just spewing this stuff, and it wasn't a forum where I could challenge him on every point, but it was making me crazy. Oh, Fab Dan C is Fab Dan C. You know what, Fab Dan C? Write this down. Get ready for it. My email, jack@treespiritproject.com. Contact me after the show, and let's at least establish a connection here if you want. Again, that's jack@treespiritproject.com. Fab Dan C. Fab Dan C.
John Spear talked about there being some natural predators still in California, but really the big picture is anyone in charge ever going to let natural processes play out? You know, we want to control it ourselves. And some people that were praising California Fish and Wildlife and talking about the elk, I just want to share some sobering information with you. The Julie Phillips let me know that some of the herds that she studied have actually disappeared under the watch of California Fish and Wildlife. That's how successful Fish and Wildlife's sustainable management is. And my understanding of these fish and wildlife programs, and they only recently had the decency to change from fish and game to fish and wildlife, is because they were looked at as game. Hey, let's manage these so that there's still something left for hunters to enjoy hunting.
Well, my understanding, they still get their money, right, from hunting tags, from licenses, right?
Most of the board of directors are hunters.
And yet, ironically, or perhaps poetically, vegan activists and hunters have something in common. One thing in common, at least, which is we both want wild animals to be out there. Of course, vegans don't want to shoot them, and hunters do. And I would argue that what hunters do is get the big animals rather than what natural selection would do, which would have the weakest animals that are not trophy worthy or the biggest to eat a lot of meat off of, the ones that they target. But at least we do want wild places. It's what I call the Teddy Roosevelt conservation. We actually want wild places where wild animals roam, whether you hunt or not. So we can agree on that. And the Fish and Game Service is pretty well, they do some good work, but a lot of awful stuff lately.
Something both Julie and Laura Cunningham have said that is in my mind regarding the elk getting to roam freely is what an educational opportunity it would be for the next generation to study ecological impacts of native animals and see how that land transforms and heals from ranching via contact with an animal that's actually supposed to be there. And it would be fascinating, you know, and provide some insight into exactly how that happens. I don't know if they would ever let that happen because of how damning the evidence would be. The Park Service, I mean, I don't think the Park Service can afford to show us that, yes, the elk should have been here all along and the cattle are what's causing the damage.
You know, you and I kind of differ on the Park Service to some extent. I mean, God knows it's going back to 1978, but the Park Service are the ones that reintroduced the Tule elk. The ranchers, you know, our Europeans.
Not this staff.
Well, yeah, I mean, this staff, I mean, we have a new superintendent too, you know, it's all constantly in flux, and they're directed from the Department of Interior. You know, they take their orders from on high, like I guess a quasi-military organization. But anyway, I want to reach out to them with this news, going back to the start of the show, with the news of yesterday's press release that they're going to take the fence down. We volunteers, we activists want to help with the labor of that. I've reached out to Melanie Gunn. I hope she responds. I left a voicemail yesterday. And I'm trying to put the word out to say, contact us. We will help provide labor. I know the Park Service is short-staffed. They always are. We can bring 20, 30 people out there, sign releases if need be for liability, and help take down fences. Would love to do that.
Well, let's see.
You think that they'd absolutely let you do that, though? They'd be like, absolutely not. This is a state thing. You guys have to stay out of it. Liability.
Well, my friend, it's federal, and there is a volunteer program. I believe Melanie Gunn works with the volunteers, and they definitely accept volunteer help under their guidance, under their tutelage, safely. It's totally doable. It just has to be the political will for it.
Well, I hope there is.
The Park Service has about 3 miles of the previous elk fence, a debunked elk fence, still standing. That is just a second barrier to the newly built one that they still haven't taken down. And when I asked Melanie Gunn about it, she was unaware of its existence. So let's see if the Park Service can even take down the fence that hasn't been serving a function for the last 10 years before we get too excited about what they're going to do with this fence.
Well, this gets a little tricky. I was out there with Derek, good old Derek, about a year ago, and there were lots of fence posts removed. I think that's why they've recently come to, it used to be called a 3-mile fence. Now they're calling it a 2-mile fence. And they, of course, they've remeasured it, but they did take down sections of fence. And I'm not an expert on that. I have walked out there and seen it, but I'm not with somebody who would say, this is the section they took down and this is where they rejiggered it to do a different boundary.
I'm talking about an entire another fence line that was the old one, and they put up a new one, and we're going to move away from the old one.
Yeah,
they never took the old one down.
West of Pierce Point Road, correct? West of the cattle guard.
Correct.
Yeah, that's where I walked with Derek. I mean, this is over a year ago now, and there was parts of it that were all these posts were down, and they had taken down some section of the fence. And in fact, my frustration with the current decision, by the way, we're dancing all over that. We're doing a weave, as I like to say, is that they actually intend to put up a elk-friendly, wildlife passable cattle fence to stop. So elk will elk will be allowed to go south finally, which is great, in the largest herd in the reserve. But cows will be prevented from going north and grazing inside what is now the elk reserve, which is great. I don't know that there's that many cows there, and I don't love the idea of putting up any more fencing. And there's another 300 miles of lower wire fencing, some barbed, some straight wire, that's all over the park. The park is infested with cows and therefore infected with wire fences to keep them onto property lines, even though the ranchers just have leases and don't own the land. That is a whole nightmare.
This national park unit is infested with non-wildlife friendly fencing. And only a couple of years ago, they put up more miles of non-wildlife friendly fencing. Private ranchers have better practices than this national park staff have.
And just to delineate what you're saying, to underline it, I was with Jim Cota, the attorney who's been such a boon as providing information to so many of us, especially me. And he showed me some fence we were standing by when we were doing water testing a couple of years ago. And it was five strands of straight wire. And the lowest one was, it was like 12 inches off the ground. And the highest one was at almost eyeball height. And there's just no way a deer could get through that. So it's anti-wildlife fencing and completely unnecessary to keep cows in. So that was not to code, as Jim pointed out, and how it gets through, a rancher just does it. And there's no, as you know, I've set you off. There was no enforcement of that, Skyward. Can you believe it? The ranchers, as if they can do whatever they want, and then they can completely ignore regulations.
And I don't know if it's a surprise to you, but the cattle already are going places that they aren't allowed to go, including the elk reserve and Abbott's Lagoon and some other highly sensitive riparian areas. So just get rid of the problem, and you won't have to spend all this money on the fencing and all this other stuff. Just get rid of the problem. The cattle are the problem. I hope you weren't about to say something about it'll be fine because there's such a small number of cattle, because we just finished talking about how 3 cattle destroy entire animal sanctuaries. They do not eat the way that wildlife do. They do not move the way that wildlife do. They're a plague. They move through like hooved locust. Sedge, I just have you in the background for a minute. Let you back in a minute. See if anyone else wanted to call in. But how much time we got?
Fab Dance also wrote, another argument I've heard about Regen believes that you will not need supplemental feed. You can just cover crop your way out of it. But of course, it goes back to more land, and cows are not bison. They don't eat and move, as Skyward just said, to repeat that. So you can't just let them run wild over the land and heal the land.
Show me one of these places that's grass-fed that isn't using supplemental feed. Show me one.
And even if you found one, it would be 100 or 200 cows, not the literally millions of cows that are needed to keep up with current demand for meat.
Point Reyes ranchers actually pushed to be allowed to grow even more crops for their cattle that are already grass-fed and grazing the land. And this brings us back to what cattle have actually done to California. You've got 3.5, 4 months of the year that doesn't look like crap, total wasteland. That's what cattle ranching has done to California. That's not what California is supposed to look like. You know, the golden hills. Most of the year, it just looks like dead, dry weeds everywhere. That's not going to work for grass-fed programs. You know, the cattle aren't eating that stuff. Maybe during the green years, but there's a reason that we have fire fuel problems in all of these grazed hillsides, because every single one of those, if you stop and look, has cattle out there in them. And it's not getting rid of the problem, is it?
And regenerative, just to repeat, full circle here. And by the way, everything I'm going to say is on my website, which is, well, for those who aren't watching but listening, treespiritproject.com/regenerative BS. So just some of the stats here. Methane, which is the big problem that regenerative ranching doesn't even address, traps about 30 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. That's what they say. It's a worse greenhouse gas. It absorbs more heat in the atmosphere than CO2, about 30 times more. Think about that. 30 times more heat absorption than CO2 over a 10-year period. It does dissipate faster than carbon dioxide, which is why we should be addressing methane emissions, which regenerative ranching simply ignores. Worse, because they eat more grass, more roughage, they produce more enteric methane. It actually increases methane emissions if you were to switch over to more regenerative.
And you go back to our existing Park Service, Melanie Gunn, who would love to see a methane digester within Point Reyes National Seashore. Again, just get rid of the problem and stop bringing in these hideous, disgusting things that if you spend this much time researching, you find out are extremely bad for the environment.
So as we're coming to the top of the hour here, maybe next week, Skyward, we'll have more information and we'll do a show. You and I will make that decision in the next couple of days. We'll do a show next Tuesday. We're here every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern time on the Point Reyes issue. If we have more, conclusive evidence that they're going to take down the fence anytime soon, we're all excited that, excuse me, I will speak for myself. I'm excited that they made a final decision and they're going to take the fence down as we expected in the NEPA process, which has been ongoing for 2 years, National Environmental Policy Act process. But when, and will it before the Trump administration moves in and appoints Kevin Lunny, rancher pal, as king of Point Reyes or whatever they will do these days, which is going to be unusual to say the least.
Or they're going to let the Grattan Ranch white boys come in and shoot the elk. I'm sorry, did I say white boys? I meant Native Americans.
Oh, there's another show idea. You and I, people, if anybody's listening and would like to suggest areas or would like us to do a show on Point Reyes or about Native American land management, which is a hot topic, which I would love to dig into with some guests. And what else were we going to? Oh, that's right. And of course, a vegan show. We just I just got to do a vegan show because I welcome people to say it's absurd and ridiculous and to have that discussion. The arguments are so overwhelming for it. Even I, a 50-year meat eater, said, I can't defend this anymore. This is absurd. And as to what you said about cattle in Point Reyes, they have to go. Cattle everywhere, in Jack Gescheidt's humble opinion, are just not defensible or sustainable. And we haven't even talked about ethics, which is this vague intellectual word, which doesn't do justice to our eating of food that we refuse to watch being made because it's so disturbing. It is so upsetting to the human psyche to watch animals mass slaughtered.
Well, we can do an episode about why the Coast Miwok still have less say in what happens in Point Reyes than the Grattan whitewashed ranch buddies do. Sorry, excuse for representation of Native American behavior.
Different tribe that doesn't have historical roots to Marin County. Is that my understanding of Graydon? I would be very careful. I want to get that fact right. Whatever it is, I'm happy to speak the truth, but I want to make sure I have the fact right. My understanding is that.
Yeah, you get in trouble there because people can dig into a tiny, tiny detail and say, oh, look, there's where there's a root.
Yeah. That's fine. I'm happy to take on, the controversial topics. You just do it, like with facts. How about that? Crazy.
Sedge is still in the back. I'll let him say goodbye.
Hey, all right, guys.
Thanks
just
for
letting
joining
you know that just because it happens out there in California doesn't mean that you're not reaching all the way out here to Indiana.
How did you find this?
Well, like I said, growing up there in California, I always try to keep track of what was going on. Sometimes they set some stuff up there that is just absolutely ridiculous, and it blows to the rest of the country. Sometimes they set up some really good stuff, and it blows to the rest of the country. So it's really good that just searching the web and saying, okay, yeah, Point Reyes grew up there. All right, this guy's talking about some good stuff out there. And I'm like, I really need to listen. And I'm going to sit here and I'm going to listen every single week, every single show that you put out there. I wanted to say earlier, a gentleman down the road for years started a bison farm out here. And it took years, and it was the biggest fight against it. Instead of raising cattle, he's raising bison. So, as far as you've got to be one side or the other, is there a medium somewhere that we could bring more people together to say, hey, could we get a movement to replace cows with bison? Because you're not going to be able to stop everybody from eating meat, and I mean that's just kind of the way it's going to be. You're never going to change that many people, and maybe 150 years from now.
So Sledge, that is a pragmatic, kind of inarguable statement you're making. But for me, my chosen role and voice is to say we don't have time, and I'm going to advocate for the idealized, which is just to get people to stop eating the stuff. And I hear you. I can't say you're wrong. I cannot. But I still want to say, just appeal to people's intelligence and their emotion both, and say, just eat less meat. I mean, at the very least, eat a lot less meat.
I'm going to cut this off because we're just going to keep going back and forth on a topic we said we weren't going to talk about.
Well put. Oh, and Fab Dan C is from Texas, which is cool. And thank you for putting my email again to him in, Jack at Tree Spirit. If you just remember treespiritproject.com, there's a contact page on there, Fab Dan C, and we can connect.
I'll throw a teaser out there. There's even a sad story to the replacement with the bison. George Werthener was talking to me about how they've messed with the breeding of the bison so much that they don't even hold those natural instincts inside of them anymore. So it's just a different looking cow, which is really sad. You always think, oh, here's a good story, and then if you look into it, there's not. Just stop effing with nature and let nature do its job, humans. We just can't let go. We just can't not manage things. And manage always means slaughter. All right.
Man age and man I cure the land.
Sign us off, Jack.
What's that? Send us off?
Yep, send us off.
Well, thanks everyone for listening in. We're here, Skylar Thomas of Watching Humans and me, Jack Gescheit of the Tree Spirit Project. Every Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern, and then there's some other times in between there too, I'm told. But yeah, listen in and check us out and make some comments. This will be posted, I think, later today on Skylar's YouTube channel. You could find it with Watching Humans, correct?
Yep, youtube.com/@watchinghumans.
And I also post a link for my treespiritproject.com website, the /podcasts page.
I appreciate that Sedge has the listen and learn mentality. That's fantastic. I was expecting a little bit more conflict today, so we'll see if more conflict calls in the future. Well, I'm going to, by the way, just a teaser, everybody, George Werthener is going to join me soon to help me make fun of hooves on the ground, wings in the sky. I already did a reaction to that Audubon cattle ranching propaganda. It's in my members section, but you're going to have an actual experienced ecologist chime in on what I had to say about it. So,
and you forgot to badmouth the Nature Conservancy, who's allegedly or rumored to be kicking in $10 million to cut the deal for Point Reyes Seashore, but they of course are notorious for grazing all the lands they own. Right. The Nature Conservancy. I got to come up with another name. This guy rubbing his eyes. Oh boy.
Our species is just so divorced from nature that whatever you think is a connection to nature is still far, far, far away.
It's such a shame. Conservation or restoration used to mean something. Now they're just pretty much awful. And I was trying to wind us down, and I'm just winding Skylar up.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.